On the morning of the 19th of February 1945, the first wave of United States Marines touched the volcanic black sand of Iwo Jima and found the island almost entirely silent. The men climbed the soft terraced sand, waited for the next wave, and began moving inland. Then the island opened up from inside a network of tunnels, bunkers, reinforced cave positions that the Japanese 109th Division had spent 14 months constructing beneath 8 square miles of rock and sulfur. More than 21,000 defenders opened fire from positions that could not be seen, could not be reached by conventional rifle fire. What followed over the next 36 days was one of the most brutal close-quarters battles in the history of the United States Marine Corps. The weapon that did more to end it than any other was not the M1 Garand rifle. It was a device that a man carried on his back, weighed 68 pounds fully loaded. The weapon was the M2-2 portable flamethrower. The Marines who carried it into the mouths of Japanese cave positions on Iwo Jima, on Peleliu, on Saipan. The casualty rate among flamethrower operators in the Pacific Theater was substantially higher than the already catastrophic casualty rates among Marine infantry in general. The men knew this. They carried the weapon anyway. This was because by 1944 the Corps had determined, through the accumulation of hard experience on Tarawa, on Roy Namur, that there was no other tool that could do what a flamethrower did to a reinforced cave position in the time available. This is the story of how that determination was reached. It is the story of a Japanese defensive doctrine that American planners had not fully anticipated, of a chemical weapon that American industry had developed in near total secrecy during the first years of the war, of the men of the Marine Corps who were trained to use it at Camp Lejeune and at the Chemical Warfare Service's training ranges in the Louisiana bayous. It is also the story of the engineers who understood by 1944 that the portable device a single man could carry was not going to be enough. The individual we need to introduce first is not a Marine. His name was Augustin Meunier Prentice, a colonel in the United States Army's Chemical Warfare Service. He had been thinking about the problem of fortified underground positions since the early days of the war in Europe. Prentice had authored a comprehensive study of chemical weapons published in 1937 that was considered standard reference material throughout the American military establishment. When the Pacific War began producing its particular tactical problem, a defending force that had burrowed into the earth and constructed firing positions that could survive direct artillery hits, Prentice and his colleagues at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland were given the task of improving the portable flamethrower the Army had inherited from its First World War designs, the M1, the first version fielded in the Pacific. It was, by the assessment of nearly every Marine officer who reported on its use at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, inadequate for the distances involved in attacking prepared cave defenses. The M2-2 that replaced it beginning in 1943 extended effective range to 40 yards and burn duration to approximately 7 to 8 seconds at full capacity. It carried a mixture of thickened fuel, napalm, a compound of naphthenic and palmitic acids mixed with gasoline that had been developed at Harvard University under contract with the Chemical Warfare Service. The napalm formulation adhered to surfaces and continued burning after the initial burst. That was the critical difference between the new fuel and the unthickened gasoline used in earlier models. Thickened fuel did all of those things simultaneously and kept burning long after the operator had moved to his next position or gone to ground under return fire. The Japanese defensive system that made all of this necessary had a formal name in Imperial Army doctrine. It was called the Fukkaku system. By the time American planners were studying it seriously in late 1943 and early 1944, the officer who had implemented it most comprehensively was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the commander of the Iwo Jima garrison. Kuribayashi had served in the United States in the late 1920s as a military attaché, and had come away from that experience with a detailed and specific understanding of American industrial capacity. He had written to his wife from Washington in 1928 that the United States was the last country Japan should ever go to war with. When he was assigned to defend Iwo Jima in June 1944, He applied that understanding to the problem in front of him with a precision and thoroughness that American commanders later described in their after-action analyses with something close to professional respect. Kuribayashi ordered his garrison to dig. He prohibited the traditional Japanese defensive doctrine of counterattacking on the beach, the banzai charge that American forces had come to expect and had learned to survive with massed firepower. Instead, every man on the island was put to work constructing a layered network of tunnels, bunkers. The finished tunnel network on Iwo Jima, when American combat engineers surveyed it after the battle, extended for approximately 11 miles beneath the island's 8 square miles of surface area, with more than 1,500 individual rooms, chambers, firing positions connected by passages wide enough to move men, supplies, and light artillery pieces. There were hospitals underground, ammunition magazines, command posts. In several locations, rooms stocked with enough food and water to sustain a garrison for months without surface resupply. Against this system, American naval bombardment and aerial bombing, that had been extensive before the landing, had achieved considerably less than pre-invasion estimates had projected. Bombardment could destroy surface positions and kill men in the open. What it could not do was eliminate a position that had been constructed specifically to survive bombardment, and that contained men who had been ordered not to appear on the surface until the Marines were close enough to engage with small arms and direct-fire weapons. The first 3 days of the Iwo Jima landing produced Marine casualties at a rate that stunned even officers who had served at Tarawa, where the losses in 76 hours of fighting had been severe enough to generate a congressional investigation into whether the Assault H had been conducted competently. The Marine Corps had been thinking about this problem for long enough that it arrived at Iwo Jima with a more systematic approach to flamethrowers than it had brought to any previous operation. Each infantry regiment landing on the island carried a specified allocation of M2-2 portable flamethrower operators, trained and equipped as specialist assault personnel rather than as ordinary riflemen who happened to be carrying an additional weapon. There were also, for the first time in any Pacific amphibious assault, armored vehicles equipped with flamethrowers in place of their main guns. These were modified M4A3 Sherman tanks fitted with the E4-5 mechanized flamethrower unit, capable of projecting a sustained stream of burning napalm to a range of approximately 150 yards with a fuel capacity, allowing for roughly 80 seconds of continuous fire. The Marines called them Zippo tanks after the lighter, though the designation in official documents was the M4A3R3. The men who crewed those vehicles belonged to the 5th Marine Division's attached tank battalion. The tactical problem they were given was more difficult in several respects than the problem given to the portable flamethrower operators. A tank had no such option. It moved on the surface. It was visible from hundreds of yards away. The Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima had been issued enough anti-tank weapons, including magnetic mines designed to be carried by individual soldiers and attached directly to a vehicle's hull. That tank operations on the island produced vehicle losses at a rate the Corps had not anticipated from its pre-operation intelligence assessments. The solution that emerged from the first week of fighting, worked out in discussions between infantry battalion commanders and tank company officers at the regimental level, rather than at any higher headquarters, was a combined arms method that became more or less standard across the rest of the campaign. A company of infantry would move to suppress the outer defensive positions surrounding a cave complex, keeping the defenders inside and preventing them from bringing anti-tank weapons to bear on the approaching vehicle. The tank, or in larger operations 2 or 3 tanks working together, would then move to within effective range of the cave entrance, direct a sustained burst of burning fuel into the opening, hold position long enough for the fire to move through the interior passages. His was not a fast process. A large cave complex on Iwo Jima could require multiple fuel loads and repeated applications over several hours before the position could be declared cleared, and Marines could enter to confirm that the garrison was no longer capable of resistance. Now here is the part that the operational histories of the Pacific War rarely describe in detail. The men who carried portable flamethrowers on Iwo Jima had an average life expectancy in combat, according to statistical analysis compiled by the Marine Corps after the battle. That was measurable in a figure so stark that senior officers declined to include it in public statements during the war. The operators understood that every Japanese rifleman, machine gunner, mortar crew in any position that could observe them would shift fire the moment the flamethrower was ignited. This was because a burning fuel tank on a man's back represented a secondary explosion that could kill or wound every other Marine within a radius of several yards. They also understood that the 40-yard range of the M2-2 was still barely adequate for the task of reaching a cave opening from a position that offered the operator any meaningful protection against the defensive fire coming out of it. The most decorated individual Marine flamethrower operator of the Iwo Jima campaign was a corporal from Pennsylvania named Herschel Woodrow Williams, whose actions on the fourth day of the battle, clearing a series of mutually supporting pillboxes over a 4-hour period that his commanding officer later described as the single most sustained act of individual combat valor the officer had witnessed in 3 years of Pacific warfare, earned him the Medal of Honor. Williams made more than a dozen separate approaches under fire to positions that his supporting riflemen could not suppress, with each approach requiring him to carry the 68-pound weapon across open ground in range of defenders who had identified him specifically and were attempting to kill him before he reached the firing point. He survived. Many of the men who carried the same weapon on the same island did not. The broader award record for the Pacific Island campaigns, reviewed as a category, shows a concentration of medals of honor awarded to men serving in assault demolitions and flamethrower roles that is statistically disproportionate to those men's share of the overall Marine force. The tank-mounted flamethrowers on Iwo Jima fired approximately 10,000 gallons of napalm fuel during the 36 days of the battle. According to the 5th Amphibious Corps after-action report submitted in April 1945, the portable operators fired an additional quantity that the Corps tracked less precisely but estimated at several thousand gallons more. The combined effect of those applications, together with demolition charges placed by combat engineers after the initial fire attack, together with artillery and naval gunfire directed against surface vents and exhaust openings identified by forward observers, was the systematic reduction of a defensive network that had been designed by one of the more capable military engineers in the Imperial Army specifically to resist exactly this kind of methodical destruction. The battle cost the Marine Corps 6,821 killed and 19,217 wounded in 36 days of fighting, the heaviest single operation casualties in the Corps' history to that point. What the after-action analysis conducted at Pearl Harbor in May and June 1945 established, what shaped the planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands that was already underway before the atomic bombs ended the war in August, was that the Iwo Jima model of cave reduction, flamethrower tanks leading, portable operators supporting, engineers following to place demolition charges, was the most efficient method available for clearing prepared underground defenses at acceptable cost in time, though not in casualties. The planners assembled under Admiral Chester Nimitz estimated that the Japanese home islands contained defensive works comparable to those on Iwo Jima, across a land area approximately 500 times larger, with a garrison several hundred times the size of the one that had held Iwo Jima for 36 days. Production orders for napalm fuel and for additional M4A3R3 flamethrower tanks were accordingly revised upward in the spring of 1945 by figures that dwarfed everything that had been produced and consumed in the entire Central Pacific campaign to that point. The Chemical Warfare Service facility at Huntsville Arsenal in Alabama, that had been one of the primary production centers for napalm fuel throughout the Pacific War, received revised production contracts in July 1945 calling for output levels roughly 4 times its existing capacity. The modification shops at Pearl Harbor and at depots on Guam and Tinian that had been converting standard M4A3 Sherman tanks to the R3 flamethrower configuration were authorized in the same period to accelerate their output on a schedule that assumed assault landings on Kyushu beginning in November 1945. The individual Marine infantry regiments being assembled and trained on Leyte in the Philippines for the Kyushu operation were each allocated flamethrower operator slots at roughly twice the density that had been considered standard at Iwo Jima. The production and training apparatus was fully in motion when the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945. The Imperial Japanese government announced its intention to surrender 9 days later,